Now, I was telling you before that there are university professors who study the ways that kids best learn how to read. In fact, all of your teachers go to school. In fact, all of your teachers study at universities before they go into the classroom to teach to figure out the best way that kids learn to read. One of the books that your teacher may have read is by these two women here. Their names are Stephanie and Anne, and they're actually experts on how kids best learn to read and understand what they read. One of the things that these authors say is that if kids are making connections to the books that they're reading while they read, they understand what they're reading better. What I mean by connections, here's what I mean by connections. Like, imagine I was reading a book like this Bill Peet book called Eli. Well, when I'm reading, like we talked about before, I don't want to be a passive reader and just let the words kind of like wash over me. I want to be an active reader, and I want to make connections with the book. There are three main types of connections you can make. One type of connection is to relate the book to myself. In a text-to-self connection, I would think about things that relate to my own life. Like this story is about a lion named Eli and a vulture bird that Eli makes friends with. So I could start by seeing if I have any connection to lions. And in fact, I do. A long time ago when I was a kid, I actually went to a circus, and my dad knew somebody who worked at the circus, and so we got to go backstage and meet the lion. It was a little scary, but the lion was with a trainer and behind like a little cage, and we got to say hello to the lion, and we learned all kinds of things about the lion. So when I'm reading Eli, I might be thinking a little bit about that time that I met a lion. You might have some kind of connection to lions too, I'm not sure. Maybe you have a stuffed animal lion, or maybe you've been to the circus before. An even better connection would be like an emotional connection. Like in the story, Eli feels a little bit lonely at the beginning. There might be a time in your life when you felt a little bit lonely. You might connect the time that Eli feels lonely to how you felt when you were lonely. A lot of times if you do some thinking, you'll have a personal connection to a story. It might not be obvious right away, but if you really think about it, you may have a connection. We're going to play a game later called Making Connections, where you're going to kind of practice this. Now another type of connection you can make is called text-to-text. So if I was reading a book, let's say I was reading Jennifer and Josephine by Bill Peet, I might think about other books or even like movies or TV shows that have something similar about them. Like this book here is about a car whose name is Jennifer, and a cat, which you can see in the back seat there, named Josephine. And so you might think about, like, have I ever read any other books about cars or seen any movies about cars? I actually saw a movie called Cars once. Or I might think about, like, for instance, I once saw a movie called The Love Bug, which is also about a car that is kind of alive. and the whole movie is all about the adventures of the car. So I might think back about what happened in that movie and kind of compare it to what happened in this book. Now, the third type of connection that you want to try to make when you're reading a book is called text to world. This is where you try to compare the text, the book that you're reading, to the world and things that have happened in real life. For instance, if I was reading this book, it's called Farewell to Shady Glade. It's a great book by Bill Peet. In the book, there are some animals who are moved out of their home. They have to run away from their home when some construction starts and people start building things right where their home was. I actually have a person I actually remember something that happened in the real world that was similar to this. Back when I lived out in California, there was like a forest, like some woods where a lot of animals lived, and they decided to build a big apartment building there. And so they had to tear down all of those woods, and they built the apartment building where the woods used to be. And I bet it was similar, like they didn't really think much about the animals who lived there and what those animals would do. So this book is kind of a similar story, and I'm able to kind of connect it to something that really happened. Now, you probably won't be able to make a connection to every single So you probably won't be able to make every type of connection to every book that you read. For instance, if I was reading this book, Jethro and Joel Were a Troll, which we're actually going to read, it's a really funny book, but it's about a two-headed troll. So unless you've had a really weird experience, you're probably not going to be able to connect that to real life. But even though you can't make a text-to-world connection with Jethro and Joel, you might be able to connect it to like another book you've read about monsters, like maybe Shrek or some other type of book. And although you probably haven't met a troll in real life, you might be able to connect it to some kind of life experience. Like as we'll see in this book, the two heads of the troll actually kind of disagree about what they should do as a troll. And so you might have had some kind of experience where you disagreed with a friend about something, or maybe with someone in your family. So it is possible to make a connection to yourself there. We're going to play a little game now, and your teacher has brought some interesting objects today, and you're going to be with a teammate, and the idea of the game is you're going to try to make as many connections as you can to the object. All of the objects are totally random, so who knows what object you'll see. But imagine if you saw an object like this. This is a plane for my daughter owns. My daughter's 1 year old, so it's kind of a plane for a baby. Now, if you got this object and you were in the game, you might think about what connections you could make to it. And actually, there's quite a few connections. Like if you were doing text to self, well, I've had some experiences flying on airplanes, so I could talk about one of those experiences. If I was trying to do text to world, well, it is a toy baby plane, but it actually looks like the planes they had in World War I because it has a propeller on the front. So I could connect it to some of the things that I know about the earliest planes that fought in World War I between Germany and the United States, and how those planes were really important in allowing the United States to win the war. If I was trying to connect it to a text, I could think about some books that I've read about airplanes and connect it that way. We're going to have 3 rounds in the game. You may not get a chance to write about all the objects, but the way the game works is you'll have a sheet like this, and some people might play by themselves, but most people will have a partner, and you will be given a random object. You'll have 1 minute to try to write down a connection between yourself and the object, a book and the object or movie, or something in the real world and the object. You can try to write down more than one if you want. We're giving out 1 point to each player on the team who is able to make a connection. If you can make more than 1 connection, then you can earn more than 1 point for that round. At the end of the round, then we'll switch up the objects and you'll have a chance to write about a second object. You'll get a total of 3 objects. Your teacher decides who gets the object, so please don't ask for any particular object. You kind of get what you get. So you can put me on pause for about 15 minutes as your teacher gets out the objects, hands out those sheets for the games, and forms the teams. I hope you have fun playing the game, and I hope you make lots of connections. Okay, so as I'm talking, your teacher should hand out the worksheet for our next activity, which is making connections to a story by Bill Peet that I'm going to read you. It's a really great story. It's called Chester the Worldly Pig, and I'll put the pictures up here while I read you the story. And your job is, at 3 different points in this story, I'm going to stop and ask you, and your job is, at 3 different parts of the story, I'm going to stop and ask you to make connections to that part of the book. It could be a text-to-self connection, something about your own life. It could be about another book or movie or show that you've seen that's similar, or you could make a connection to the real world. All right, so here's Chester the Worldly Pig. "Of all things," grumbled Chester, "why on earth did I have to be a pig? A pig is no better off than a cabbage or a carrot, just something to eat. But before I end up as so much sausage and ham, I intend to try and amount to something." Right away, I noticed a connection actually to another book that we've read. Actually, this book has a connection to another text, The Wingding-Dilly. I'll tell you what, let's take 30 seconds and talk with a partner. Do you see a text-to-text connection between Chester the Worldly Pig and The Wingding-Dilly? Ready? Let's turn and talk. Your teacher can put me on pause for a second and share out if your teacher wants to. But the connection that I noticed was, remember in The Wingding-Dilly, Scamp really doesn't want to be a dog at first? And here, Chester really doesn't want to be a pig. So the setup of both stories are kind of similar. Of course, different things are going to happen. Chester's not going to be turned into a Wingding-Dilly, but some adventures are on the way. But what else could a pig ever be? That was Chester's main problem, and he turned this around and around in his head until one day it suddenly came to him. I'll be a star in the circus. Now, what gave Chester such a crazy idea was a circus poster which appeared on the barn wall one sunny morning in May, and what caught the little pig's eye was a seal with a ball balanced on the tip of his nose. "The nose," said Chester, "that's the thing. Surely my flat pig snout must be good for something. You know, pigs have those flat noses." And he searched the pig pen for an idea. There was only a trough, a fence, and a mud puddle. "The trough is much too heavy," he decided, "and I can't very well balance a fence or a mud puddle on my nose, so it'll have to work just the other way around. I'll balance my nose on something, on the flat top of a fence post." Now, anyone knows that a pig can't climb, but Chester couldn't let this bit of useless knowledge hold him down, and with a slight boost from an overturned bucket, he struggled up the side of the fence until he was finally perched on the top rail. Now came the tricky part. Placing his snout, his nose, squarely on the post, he carefully raised one leg in the air and then the other, and with a flurry of short kicks he launched his body up over his head, and for one instant he teetered upside down on his nose. But then down he tumbled to land with a sploosh in the feed trough. "Well, so far so bad," he muttered. But Chester had no idea of quitting. Before he ever mastered the trick, he expected to take quite a few such tumbles. And indeed he did. He took hundreds of tumbles that day, and by nightfall he was very weary and tired and a badly bruised pig. But, surprisingly enough, his spirits were high. The last effort had been a great improvement. He held his balance for what he guessed to be a full minute. And the next morning, after a few more falls, Chester had mastered this impossible feat. He could stand on his nose for as long as he pleased, and now he was all ready to be discovered. This was no big problem. It had been figured out from the beginning. A railroad ran right past the farm, and the pig was sure that sooner or later the circus train would be coming by there. Whenever he heard a locomotive chugging far down the track, he would scramble up the fence and quickly go into his nose stand. He was always ready just in case. And then, sure enough, early one morning, there came the circus train with its long, flat cars loaded with Then, sure enough, early one morning there came the circus train with its long, flat cars loaded with animal wagons and tent poles, followed by the elegant red coaches. As the coaches rumbled by, Chester could tell from his upside-down view that all the window shades were drawn. They were closed. On the train between the towns, the weary, tired circus people always tried to catch up with their sleep, so nobody happened to see the pig on the post. "Oh, well," sighed Chester, "it looks like I'll have to take a trip." And he scrambled to the ground outside the fence and set off down the railroad track. It was as simple as that. There was no need to worry about the farmer, for he was always so busy he didn't even know he owned a little spotted pig. And when Chester went trotting by the field where he was plowing, the man merely chuckled. "Well now, it appears to me that somebody's pig pen could stand a little fixin'." It's actually his own. Chester realized that the circus might have gone a long way before stopping to set up the tents, no telling how far. So he settled down to a good steady dog trot, with his eyes fixed on the track just ahead. I'd like you to try to make a connection now, either to another story or to your own life or to the world. And the connection I'd like you to make is Chester is setting out on a trip now. Can you think of any connections that you could make where someone's setting out on a trip? Go ahead and in the first box in your paper, write down your connection. Try to write at least 2 sentences or more if you can. We'll be giving points for a lot of writing. Okay, let's begin. All right, I hope you were able to come up with a connection. Actually, there is kind of another connection to the Wingding-Dilly. Remember, Scamp sets off on a trip for a different reason, but he also sets off on a trip. Or maybe you had a time in your life where your family set off on a trip or a voyage, or maybe you moved somewhere. In any case, let's continue with the story. And before he knew it, there was the big top, and he stopped with an oink of surprise. This huge mountain of canvas looming above a bustling city of tents and wagons was almost too much for a little farm pig to take all at once, and at first he could only stare in amazement. Then, sternly, he warned himself, "If I lose my nerve now, I'm through before I even start. So if I'm going to be a big star, it's time I got used to big things. The bigger, the better." And with renewed courage, he went trotting ahead into the bustling circus lot. Chester was nimble and quick for a pig, and he managed to dodge and sidestep his way through the army of hustling roustabouts without getting kicked or stepped on. When he came to an open space near the back door of the big top, he picked out a tent stake exactly the right height, and on his very first try went into a perfect nose stand, just like he had done back on the farm. Then, in no time at all, Chester was discovered by the circus tall man. "Hey, everybody!" he shouted. "Look at that little old pig way down there!" And suddenly Chester was the center of attention, with everyone talking at once. "Say, that's a pretty nifty trick! A real ding-dong doozy! Why, he's a natural-born acrobat! Where'd he come from? What's the difference? Let's put him into the show!" And Chester was suddenly hustled away to a dressing tent. Two attendants tied a red ribbon around his middle, fastened a feathery plume on his head, and gave his precious snout a bit of a shine with a dab of pink shoe polish. And the next thing the little pig knew, he was riding into the big top at the head of the grand parade on a magnificent white stallion led by a beautiful circus queen. "It just can't be true," thought Chester, tingling with excitement. "This must be a glorious dream. It's much too good to last." And indeed it was too good to last. In a very short while, "It just can't be true," thought Chester, tingling with excitement. "This must be a glorious dream. It's much too good to last." And indeed, it was too good to last. In a very short while, the glorious dream was turned into more of a nightmare. You might use your prediction skills that we practiced before to try to predict what's going to happen to poor Chester. But what I really want you to do right now is fill out the second box and try to make a connection to circuses. Maybe you've been to a circus. Maybe you've seen a circus in a movie. Maybe you've read a book also about the circus. Try to make a connection in box number 2. Okay, let's take about a minute and begin. Okay, so for to Chester's horror, when the main show began, he found himself in the big cage with 5 ferocious tigers. Someone had decided that the small pig's act must be more spectacular. It needed an element of danger, and the ringmaster's booming voice filled the tent as he announced the spectacular new act. Now, for the very first time anywhere, we proudly present Percival the Performing Pig, the one and only pig with the dauntless courage and daring ever to perform in the same arena with the savage beasts of the jungle, the tigers. Just as the announcement was finished, the courageous Percival fainted. That's Chester, and he was quickly carried out of the big cage amid a storm of hooting and jeering from the angry spectators. Chester was quickly revived with a splash of cold lemonade, and then he was dressed in baby clothes with a lace bonnet tied under his chin, and Roscoe the Clown, in a frilly skirt and flowered hat, wheeled him around the big top in a doll buggy. A rippling wave of laughter followed after them, and someone squealed, "Oh, what a darling, adorable little pig!" And after 5 or 6 trips around the tent, the poor pig had turned almost the color of the clown's needle nose. He's red with embarrassment. Late that night, after the last performance, Roscoe took off his costume and makeup. Then, without so much as one glance at Chester, he turned down the lamp and crawled into bed, leaving the disgruntled pig chained to a tent post and still wearing that miserable bonnet and dress. There was no way to wriggle out of the chain, for the ribbon was tied in a double knot under his chin, so he suspected that as long as he was Roscoe's pig, this was going to be his costume day and night. "Well, one thing," vowed Chester, "I'll give this old clown the slip." That means like he'll try to run away the first chance I get. And indeed, Chester is going to run away. His first came... Now Chester really is going to run away. Chester's first chance came on the very first train trip. Roscoe hadn't bothered to chain his pet pig. He kept him under the seat with his suitcase, figuring if the pig got loose on the train, he wouldn't get very far. But Chester figured otherwise, and as the clown was lighting a cigar, he squirted from under the seat and went racing away down the aisle. Roscoe was surprisingly fast for an old fellow, and halfway down the car, the big clown's feet were slapping close at the panicky pig's heels. He would have caught Chester for sure if the tall man hadn't left a long leg out in the aisle. Old Roscoe tripped and went sprawling, and by the time he picked himself off the floor, the pig had reached the caboose and squeezed his way out the door. We're going to finish up Chester the Worldly Pig a little bit later. Right now we're going to spend a last 15 minutes kind of reading through the Bill Peet collection of books that we have and start to really think about which book project you're going to pick for our book project gallery. One of the books that we have that I wanted to point out to you is called The Autobiography of Bill Peet. One of the books that I wanted to point out to you is called Bill Peet, an Autobiography. An autobiography is when someone writes their own story. And Bill Peet actually wrote an autobiography all about his own life, about how he became a writer of children's books. What's kind of interesting is that some of the illustrations in the books look a lot like the stories. What's kind of interesting is some of the illustrations in the books actually look a lot like the illustrations in the storybooks that Bill Peet writes, except these illustrations are about his own life. For instance, in the book, he talks about how he was once one of the original illustrators for Walt Disney, and he used to illustrate Mickey Mouse cartoons and Donald Duck cartoons way back when those cartoons first started. Anyway, he has lots of other interesting adventures too, so you might check that book out. And one of the projects that you can choose to do is to write your own autobiography. That means to write the history of yourself and your life so far. You don't have to do that, but that's one of the options. Let's continue to read from the Bill Peet collection for about 15 more minutes, and then I want to come back and talk about each of the projects and then have you choose which one you'll be working on, either by yourself or with a partner. Okay, let's set the timer for 15 minutes and let's begin.